Okay guys, I feel like we have been working up to this moment all year, but it is finally time. These are my best books of 2023. And you know, this year has had many highlights. We've had Barbenheimer, we've had the Eras tour, we had the Gwyneth Paltrow ski accident court case, and the publishing industry too has had a lot of crazy moments this year. We've had hockey, smut, scandals. We had an author fake her own death in order to sell copies of her book. And even in the past week, there has been an author who basically review bombed other debut novelists with 1-star reviews and then kept giving her own book 5-star reviews, and obviously they found out, and quite frankly it has been one for the books, and that is what I wanted to talk about today. The books. I read 200 books in the past year because I'm not well up here, but seriously, as a full-time book critic, this is what I've dedicated my life to, and so today I wanted to talk to you about the top 10% of those books, the best of the best, the creme de la creme. These are my personal favorites. I also made a video about my worst books of the year, so you know, you can kind of choose your own destiny here. That video was about being a hater. My hateritis was flaring up, but in this video it's just good vibes. We're just talking about things that I thought were great, like incredible pieces of art. So this video is kind of like the antidote to the worst books of the year video, because I'm a Libra and it's all about balance. So these were the books that I read and loved in 2023, which were released more or less in the past year. I'm also going to do a part 2 to this video with all of the books that I discovered this year that are kind of like gems from previous years, classics, because quite frankly there were too many books to talk about. So the second part to this video will come kind of in that like weird purgatory time between Christmas and New Year, so watch out for that one. But these are my new favorite new releases, starting with the book that single-handedly cured my big book fear. Like this year we are finally beating the he only reads short books allegations. It's over, because Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver just perfectly toes the line between being genuinely heartbreaking and equally hilarious. And you know what, I'll level with you. When I heard about a 600-page Charles Dickens retelling, I thought that sounds like my worst nightmare. Like on paper, I should have hated this book. But on this paper, I just fell in love and found so many treasures. I thought this book was extraordinary and such an achievement. It really is a book that just feels like an instant classic because of the way it is written. It's a masterclass in character creation. It's about a boy called Demon Copperhead who is growing up in Virginia, born to a single mother, in a trailer. It explores the idea that poverty is not something that you choose, it is something that happens to you, and that is made stark and explored through the lens of a child. He is a product of the destitute context that he is born into. In the postcode lottery, he lives in a place that other people refer to as the right poor. And the author, Barbara Kingsolver, is in constant conversation with Dickens, who came before her. She discusses the monster truck mud rally of the childcare system and foster parents, abusive stepfathers, and having to step up to be the hero of your own narrative, of your own life. And I think the fact that this draws attention to the themes of another novel which was literally written in 1850 proves that the themes of its predecessor are still just as relevant in today's world, in contemporary society and in the modern day. These are injustices, inequalities we have not corrected. These are evils that human beings are still capable of inflicting upon one another. I have to read you this quote. There's this thing that happens, let's say at school, where a bunch of guys are in the bathroom at the urinal, laughing about some dog that made an anus of himself in gym. You're all basically nice guys, right? You know right from wrong, and would not in a million years be brutal to the poor guy's face. And then it happens. The dork was in the shitter. He comes out of the store with this look. He heard everything. And you realize you're not really that nice of a guy. This is what I would say if I could to all smart people in the world with their dumb hillbilly jokes. We are right here in the stall. We can actually hear you. This character pours through in every single line. I think she just updates the quintessentially British voice to this southern boy with his colloquialisms and his idiosyncrasies. And you feel like you really know him because of how detailed this portrayal is, you know, how this portrait of him is crafted through every metaphor and simile and analogy and anecdote. They capture his perception of the world, the way that he would interpret events, the way that he would understand his surroundings, the way he speaks, his naivety, his vulnerability. Like, this is one of the strongest, most believable characters I've ever read. It's a Bildungsroman, so we see him in his kind of coming of age years, his personal and spiritual development, following Demon through his formative years. It's also set amidst the backdrop of the opioid crisis, and Barbara Kingsolver explores how easy it is to talk about things like poverty and addiction when it's an abstract, when it's a concept that is not affecting you. But for this boy, addiction is inescapable. It's everywhere. It's friends, it's lovers, it's family. And yet his unfaltering spirit is what carries him through and what illuminates this novel. Maybe this quote here sums it up best. She says, "The wonder is that you could start life with nothing, end with nothing, and lose so much in between." This won the Women's Prize and the Pulitzer Prize this year, and deservedly so. And now I'm sure she'll be thrilled to know she has a place on my list too. And then another very critically acclaimed book that I loved this year was In Memoriam by Alice Wynne. This also feels to me like an instant classic. Like, pull up the literary canon, a hot new bombshell has entered the villa. And here's the thing, World War I and World War II novels have been done, and they can sort of feel like a bit of a broken record at this point. And so to add to that conversation in 2023, you need to be doing something so unique and original and frankly groundbreaking, and this is all of the above and then some. It's a tender and heartfelt elegy for boyhood and first love and innocence and bodily autonomy, and a very specific time too in Britain before a great war like this. We follow two boys at this idyllic kind of boarding school in England where everything is jolly and ostentatious. They speak in verse, and yet simultaneously war is raging in Europe, and they're reading the school newspaper and starting to recognize names of their fellow students on the death roll. These people they know have been conscripted to fight on the front lines and lost their lives. And one of the two boys that we follow has German heritage, has German roots, and so people in his local area start to kind of point fingers and act a little bit suspicious around him and his family. And so, in order to kind of shut them up, he decides, even though he's underage, to enlist. And so he heads from the classroom to the trenches. And I would say that I think the fact that we've seen him at school really creates this juxtaposition, I suppose, of childlike innocence on a battlefield. He just feels so exposed all of a sudden, stripped from where he should be, from where he belongs and with the people he belongs with. And so now this boy Gaunt has always had a bit of a crush on this guy, Elwood, his best friend. And what he doesn't realize is that Elwood is also yearning for him. And after some time passes, Elwood also enlists and joins him on the front line. He thought perhaps all the pain would sour the love, but instead it drew him further in, as if he were Mark Antony falling on his own sword. And it was a magical thing to love someone so much. It was a feeling so strange and slippery, like a sheath of fabric cut from the sky. And I actually didn't realize when I first read this book that the author Alice Wynne actually kind of cut her literary teeth, I suppose. Her creative writing origin was in writing fan fiction. That's kind of how she sharpened her pencil, shall we say. And I actually think that equipped her with this really gorgeous ability to capture really intense yearning and longing and lust, and ultimately love between these two people. And so setting this on the landscape of violence and tragedy just makes the stakes so much higher. Like, it really is a case of life or death in these drastic situations. And so the tone shifts when the context does. Once being confronted with the bleakness of this setting, Gaunt's mentality has been warped and shifted, and he has to learn to understand Elwood again, given their new context, given their new experiences of the world's brutality. Elwood smiled, and a sudden dry bleakness spread over Gaunt's heart as he thought of Hercules and Hector and all the heroes in myth who found happiness briefly, only for it not to be the end of the story. And I think that the central theme in this novel really is bravery. It's about bravery to step over the corpses of people that you know, people that you went to school with, and still stand with the knowledge that you may yourself join them and be killed. It's about the bravery of staying alive. It's about the bravery of resilience, the bravery of facing adversity and overcoming it, the bravery to deal with trauma, but also the bravery to acknowledge one's own innate desires and identity, the bravery to love yourself and to love others for who you and they really are. And honestly, this is nothing short of a masterpiece. Hang this in the Louvre because it's a work of art, and I can't wait to see what Alice Wynne does next, because it's safe to say I am a fan. Which is basically a segue to the next book I wanted to speak about, which is called I'm a Fan. This is by Sheena Patel. It was longlisted for this year's Women's Prize, which is how it kind of came onto my radar. And it's about this obsessive love, in which our unnamed narrator is besotted with this man who does not love her back. We realise pretty early on that he does not perceive or respect her in the same way that she cares for him. And she also starts cyber-stalking the woman that man is actually dating, and ends up with this really odd parasocial relationship with that woman. And the observations of this book are mesmerizingly sincere. So in this section, she's talking about why she desires this man so much. I want it so no one else can have it. In the not having, it remains absolutely perfect. In my imagination, it would fulfill all my needs. I would never need anyone again. I want it so that in the luxury of having it, I can ruin its perfection and then reject it when I am sure it means nothing. I want to succeed where all the other women failed, and it is not so much to win him as it is to defeat everyone else. The novel thinks about power dynamics, about unrequited feelings, about emotional manipulation, and also the sheer ferocity of love, the crazy things it can make people do and feel, the merciless ways that love can tear us apart and make us behave. But as well as all that, this is a study on race and class and privilege, and that's all told through a series of pretty short, punchy chapters. Whiteness and white people make themselves pervasive, yet think of themselves as separate. It is parental and condescending in tone. It invented the concept of race conferring upon itself, a freak genetic accident, the values of intelligent advancement, beauty, whereby the lower the level of melanin in the body, the higher your place in the hierarchy. The lighter the skin tone, the closer you are to whiteness, therefore the better. More beautiful you are regarded, the more suited to power you are. The simplicity of this belief is in tandem with its terrible violence. And it also discusses the pervasiveness of social media and how on dating apps, for example, an algorithm gets to know you before a human can. And one of the really interesting parts to me was the depiction of this character who she's obsessed with, who essentially withholds love from her, and how withholding that affection turns it into a more valuable commodity. The way that he turns it into something she craves so desperately that it fundamentally increases its value and causes our central protagonist to just go completely off the rails. It's a weird book, but so perceptive and so brilliant. I loved this. Okay, let's do more weird stuff. This is The Guest by Emma Cline. I love weird books. This is set at the end of a sultry summer in Long Island, and we follow this woman who is the guest in so many people's lives. She is this perpetual guest, always kind of coming and going, never really sticking around for too long, and we realise pretty early on that she is essentially manipulating people into feeling pity for her, for doing things for her. And when we join her, she has been working as an escort and stole a bunch of money from someone and is now essentially on the run from him and sort of hopscotching between different people, taking advantage of them, stealing their money a lot of the time, and using them for her own advancement. She is the anti-hero Taylor Swift was talking about. And yet, in spite of all of that, you kind of find yourself rooting for her. There's something about this really lonely state of existence, her deep desire to be loved, and also her disconnect from social mobility. Like, even though she occupies spaces with very wealthy people, she is totally separate from their world. And there's this inevitability that she always has to leave. You know, this is not a permanent residency for her. Also, the misguided ways that she pursues affection, it just makes her so vulnerable that I just kind of found myself wanting to see her win in the end. Alex drained her wine glass, then her water glass. The ocean looked calm, a black darker than the sky. A ripple of anxiety made her palms go damp. It seemed suddenly very tenuous to believe that anything would stay hidden, that she could successfully pass from one world to another. And I thought this was so smart because you start to slowly become desensitized to her worldview and to her bad behavior. Like, after a while, she would be rummaging through some random person's wallet and she'd be like, damn it, they only have 20s. And I'd be like, Oh man, she steals from people, she lies, she commits fraud and identity theft multiple times on almost every page and leaves destruction in her wake. It's like her life is this motor car just speeding up and spiraling totally out of control. But it's a car crash that you just can't really look away from. And she is becoming totally and utterly twisted up in her lies and in this game and in her deceits. And yet, I'm rooting for her. I thought the writing was super smart. Like on multiple occasions, she meets people who say, they predict that she must be like 25. They always say that same number, and every time she corrects them to say she's actually only 22. And I was thinking, are we being manipulated too here? Is she actually 25? It can't be a coincidence that everyone thinks she looks 25 and then it turns out she's actually 22. You know, that specific number I felt was reminding us that our perception of this character is also flawed because she is so unreliable. So she kind of has this like slippery liquid quality to her, and actually water is a really important motif in this book. There's the liberation and the temporary peace of swimming in the sea, which is always disrupted by the waves, you know? The inevitability that the next wave will come. Also, the first faux pas she kind of makes in the book is falling into a swimming pool with someone else's husband. A lot of the scenes take place at beach clubs or in swimming pools. There are so many bodies of water, and I think it's asking the question, will she sink or swim? Because she's ultimately a character who is treading water, and we can see that it's not sustainable. But like I said, she has this kind of liquid quality in her character too, where she kind of slips between the cracks and she's hard to grasp onto. She's not solid. So I thought this was brilliant because Emma Cline just has complete control over the tension of this book at all times, even when her character doesn't. But I do think because not a lot happens in this book, it may not be for everyone. I just personally really loved it. Now, if I had a nickel for every time a Claudia Pinheiro book has made me cry in public, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice, right? This is A Little Luck. It's by Claudia Pinheiro. It's translated by Francis Riddle from the Spanish. And we enter this story knowing that a shocking accident has taken place, which has caused a mother, who is our main character, to become estranged from her son. And throughout the book, she almost tries to tell us about the event, but can't quite tell us the entire story. And it really feels like you're witnessing someone experiencing or trying to recount their trauma. Over the novel, that specific story does build up and we do learn the full truth, but also the novel builds up over time to this huge crescendo and this confrontation with the truth that just feels like a sucker punch to the belly. It takes so many words to recount events that occur in a matter of minutes, seconds, fractions of time that are barely perceptible. Things happen so quickly that the words needed to describe them are never able to keep up, just as it can take years for fleeting events to be forgotten. Sometimes those memories will never fade. An instant can stay with us our entire lives, relived in words 1,000 times over, like a punishment. Time is compressed, and the narration of that time has to expand to make it comprehensible. And you can feel the ache of this novel right in the pit of your stomach for like days after finishing it, but in a very cathartic way, like someone smacking you around the face and then you saying, "Thank you, Claudia. Thank you so much." I thoroughly enjoyed that. Thank you for slapping me back to reality, you know? Let me just read you one more thing from this. The abyss calls to you. Sometimes you don't even feel its pull. There are those who are drawn to it like a magnet, who peer over the edge and feel a desire to jump. I'm one of those people, capable of plunging headlong into the abyss to feel, finally, free, even if it's a useless freedom, a freedom that has no future, free only for the brief instant that the fall lasts. Like, hello? We cannot keep letting Claudia Pinheiro get away with this. With each book, she rips my heart out, tears it into tiny little pieces, and then throws it over me like confetti. And I love it. I would read her toilet paper, quite frankly. Moving on. Another very reliable author for me who I discovered this year was Claire Keegan. And this book, Foster, again feels like a modern classic already. And I think that's because it follows the literary tradition of books like Anne of Green Gables, where a girl goes to live with a foster family. In this case, because the girl's mom just keeps popping out babies. Baby number 9 is on its way, which is frankly impressive. That's not just labor, that's a full-time job. No shame in that, a couple is allowed to have hobbies. And so the girl is sent to live with a foster family. And over the course of the summer she spends with them, she forges this really deep bond with that family. And that's through just participating in mundane things like going shopping or going to the beach. But the point is, it's all because she is finally receiving affection and attention from the adults around her. And that is what facilitates her flourishing. And in the book, she says, maybe the way back will somehow make sense of the coming. And this year I found so much comfort in those particular words, because maybe the way back, maybe the recovery is what helps us to understand what got us here in the first place. The book is really tender and understated. It's short too, it's only 87 pages, and yet it says everything it needs to, so concisely and effectively. But I will also say that silence is a really important theme in this novella. Like, we quickly realize that the things that aren't being said are just as important as the things that are, and I think that is best summarized by this idea right here. You don't ever have to say anything, he says. Always remember that as a thing you need never do. Many's the man lost much just because he missed a perfect opportunity to say nothing. In this new environment she is in, she is given space to blossom and thrive and to be a little girl. Whereas at home, her energy goes into working, looking after her siblings, etc. And again, just like Demon Copperhead, she is a victim of her own circumstances, a victim of her socio-economic background, of the postcode lottery, in which she has been born into a world of poverty, and this new environment that she's in is a world of abundance. This water is cool and clean as anything I've ever tasted. It tastes of my father leaving, of him never having been there, of having nothing after he was gone. And again, there is this inevitability of having to return to your real life. These things are transient, they cannot last. And the ending of the novel, I'm not going to spoil it, but it is kind of left ambiguous. You could take the line in two different ways. There are two different interpretations of the final page, and I loved that because it means that you keep thinking about the novel long after you turn that final page, and you still get value out of it even if it is only 87 pages. This book is small but mighty. It packs such a punch. I had shivers whilst reading this, and I really do think that Irish authors study the human condition in a really fascinating way. They really put the human condition under a microscope, whether that's one person or a family. So we'll quickly talk about Irish authors specifically, but this was another favourite book of mine from this year. This is Paul Murray's The Bee Sting, which in my humble opinion is a perfect book. I cannot fault this, even if I tried. It's an Irish family saga about one very ordinary nuclear family, mother, daughter, son, father, and we see each of their perspectives. We open with the teenage daughter, which is funny and witty, and it deals with her world in a very empathetic way. You know, like, when you're a kid, there are things that adults may consider to be superficial or frivolous or silly, but the author discusses them and talks about them with the seriousness and the intensity of which you do experience them in the moment, kind of without judgment. We understand why she responds to situations in the way that she does because of her age and because she feels so real. And in the early chapters, the way that she and her brother describe their parents makes them out to be kind of these like caricatures, you know, they're very one-dimensional. And then we get to see their perspectives of the same events, and this just adds so much texture. It's like we're just layering up the story person by person. I think this quote sums that up very well. But in life, he discovered, parenthood was like, it was living with a person, a new person, with strong opinions, strong tastes, arbitrary swings of emotion, and all of them addressed at you. You were the passive one. The work of care was primarily to endure, to weather the endless, buffering storms of unmediated will. And on a craft level, I just feel like everything in this book is so expertly done. It's experimental in all the right ways. One of the characters, the mother, is written with no punctuation in her story, which represents the way that she has lost control of her life. Just as her sentences lack order, they lack structure, they lack refinement, so does she. I also think the naivety of youth is captured perfectly, the perils of growing up, the embarrassment you have about your own parents, and then realizing that they are just humans and they're fallible and they're experiencing life for the first time just like you are. And really I think the book is about the butterfly effect, how things can spiral from one particular moment, but also how we each perceive that same particular moment differently. So the title, The Bee Sting, is a good example of that, where we're introduced to a situation where a bee stings someone and we later find out from a different point of view that actually it's much more complicated than how it was first introduced to us and how one other character perceives it. I enjoyed the way that this contemplated gossip and truth and how things get muddled and blurred and obscured as they are passed on from person to person, about the inaccuracies in the stories we tell each other, but also the inaccuracies in the stories we tell ourselves. pages. This is a huge novel, but the pages basically turn themselves. You get so lost and caught up in the story. And at first, the individual perspectives are quite long, but then they get shorter and shorter as the book goes on until we reach this huge crescendo. And then the final thing I wanted to talk about when it comes to this book, which I think is really, really important, is the way that the climate crisis is discussed. He points out the ubiquity of the climate crisis, and he says, global apocalypse is not interested in your identity politics or who you pray to or what side of the border you live on. And there's this inevitability towards entropy, that the world will inevitably spiral into chaos, whether that's just the family that we're following and their actions or the climate crisis. So this was my personal favourite book that was shortlisted for this year's Booker Prize, but I was also really happy with the book that won because I rated both of them 5 stars. And the overall winner of the prize was actually another Irish Paul. I imagine this being kind of like that Spider-Man meme where they're both like, wait, what? But this is a novel called Prophet Song. It's by Paul Lynch. Like I said, it won the Booker Prize this year. It's about a dystopian version of Ireland in a not too distant future, and I think this would come under the category of speculative fiction because it imagines Ireland in a totalitarian state. And this follows an unspecified disaster, and then the novel opens with a knock at the door in the middle of the night, where this woman's husband is called in for questioning. And that's really how this book feels. Like, imagine the idea of being in your house in the middle of the night and just hearing a sudden knock at the door. You know, it's disorientating, it's terrifying. This book makes you feel just as vulnerable as that moment does too. And the novel is about what this woman will do to pull her family through this situation. It's a book about rebellion, about resistance, about resilience, but it's also a book about survival and getting through the darkest of times. I think it's excellently done, masterfully crafted, a really important work of fiction that deserved to be a 2023 winner because it feels so essential and urgent and pertinent and relevant to the world that we live in right now. And there's this one quote that I think we all need to hear at this particular moment in time. History is a silent record of people who could not leave. It is a record of those who did not have a choice. You cannot leave when you have nowhere to go and have not the means to go there. You cannot leave when your children cannot get a passport, cannot go when your feet are rooted in the earth, and to leave means tearing off your feet. And that reminds me of one of my favourite poems, which is called Home. It's by Walton Shire, and it grapples with the idea of how much it means for people to have to flee their homeland in a time of crisis. And I think it's really important that Paul Lynch set this in Ireland, because really and truly, I think for a lot of people, it's a reality check to say, why do you only care when this happens to white people? Like, how come you're only willing to listen when the victims look and sound like you? And I think a lot of people needed that. So this is Prophet Song. But quickly, before I move on to talking about the next book, I just wanted to let you know that one of my other best things of 2023 has been Squarespace. Because Squarespace is the all-in-one platform for building a website or an online brand with absolutely no need to be an expert web developer or to be a master in code and tech. You can use their templates where they have hundreds of them, which can accommodate anything your heart desires. So you can let your creativity soar using these as the perfect launch pad. There are also great features, including the ability to make an email sign up, to set up a blog so you can keep people updated with what's going on behind the scenes, and also incredible analytical tools so that you can keep track of what people are enjoying and therefore what you should make more of. If this all sounds good, you can give Squarespace a go by using their free trial over on their website, and then when you're ready to launch your snazzy new website, you can use the code jackedwards at squarespace.com/jackedwards to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. And thank you so much to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. And the next book I loved this year, the most recent addition to this list, the book I read right at the end of the year, is After Safo. This is by Selby Wynne Schwartz, and it is unlike anything I've ever read. It's basically a series of vignettes, and they're about a range of different women who have come after Safo, the Greek lesbian poet. So we go through history following people like Virginia Woolf and Gertrude Stein, and this fascinating cast of women who all collide and intersect throughout history. And so these women essentially make up a chorus kind of voice. The narrative voice is a collective one, and this act of creating a we out of a collection of oppressed people creates this really transgressive voice of women who have demanded freedom by autonomy or liberation through loving other women. And then the one consistent thing throughout all of these kind of fragments that links everyone is the poetess Safo. And her poetry has this kind of seductive quality, like she existed in her own kind of utopia or Eden, this desirable perfect state. And each of the women that we follow kind of dream of returning to that. We wanted stories set about us, like gleaming surfaces, reflecting and burnishing our hopes. Was it not at last our time to become? The overall narrative develops in a non-linear way, but with a general forward motion, kind of starting in the 1880s and onwards. And so we do witness the development of modern feminism, of women's suffrage, and also lesbianism, but these are not straightforward, like they once didn't exist and now they do. There's a lot of conflict and tension and pushback and setback and unfulfilled promises. And yet throughout it all, the author encourages us to consider and ponder the power of the collective voice. When people come together, they can achieve incredible things. I also just loved the reverence for art that this book contained. A poet is someone who stands on the doorsill and sees the room before her as a sea whose waves she might dive through. Like, the writing is so lyrical, it feels like a poem too. So this just feels like a celebration of women, specifically women who rejected the notion that women should be docile and quiet. And so it takes their stories from black and white and illuminates them in vibrant colour, and I liked it a lot. Another very experimental novel is this one. This is If an Egyptian Cannot Speak English by Noor Naga. Now this is divided up into sections, and the final section is basically a transcript where a writing class are critiquing the rest of the novel, and the writer themselves are kind of like quiet for most of it. And so she sort of addresses different issues within the narrative and speaks from the perspective of her contemporaries, and I thought it was so interesting, like such a fascinating way to end your book. Very meta. I mean, like, the fourth wall is shattered. Fleabag walked, so this could run, so this could sprint like Usain Bolt. And I am noticing a trend here that I seem to love books with unnamed central characters. I'm not sure how that's really happened, but the characters in this book don't have names either. They're often just referred to as like the Egyptian man or the American girl. A woman who has Egyptian heritage goes to Cairo and ends up in a relationship with a local man, and we see from both of their perspectives. And so the book becomes this exploration of both power and otherness and the ways that we perceive things, but also there's always this imbalance between them, and who exactly this balance favors is often fluctuating in different scenarios. There's a danger between us, but I'm not always sure who it belongs to, which of us needs protection, and which of us should be afraid. It's a toxic, sometimes abusive relationship, and the book also grapples with drug addiction and grief and resentment and identity and belonging. And I thought it was a really interesting take on the diaspora by considering how one's identity alters based on its proximity to home, and where one has more power and where one has less. This here was a passage I will never forget reading. This desperation to refashion ourselves into the most pleasing form makes fools of us. We're pliable and capricious, shed our skin at the slightest threat, and ultimately stick out everywhere we go. We were both more convincing Egyptians in New York than we'd ever be on this side of the Atlantic. There I had enough Arabic to flirt with the halal guys and the Yemenis at my deli. At school, identity was simple. My name etched in hieroglyphics on a silver cartouche at my throat. I could say, back home we do it like this, pat our bread flat and round, never having patted bread, flat or otherwise. But here, I keep saying I'm Egyptian and no one believes me. I'm the other kind of other. Someone come from abroad who could just as easily return there. And so just as the title refers to two different cultures, two states, two identities, the book grapples with this as well, existing between states. And this is something I'm always intrigued by, just like with the bee sting, how two people can perceive the same exact event in completely opposite ways. How two realities can be true at the same time, despite being different, you know? I find that as a concept really, really captivating. So I think that's why I always really gravitate to and enjoy books that contemplate that. The next book is one of my personal heroes, but also by title, it is the hero of this book. And the hero that this book is referring to is actually Elizabeth McCracken's mother. This is a poignant and moving portrayal and portrait of a person, specifically her mother, but it's also about herself and the concept of daughterhood. She loved being alive and in the world. Being alive and in the world with her was like dancing with someone who really knew how to lead. And I think that sums up their relationship quite nicely, but this is kind of an elegy which is as delightful and witty as it is profoundly and astutely philosophical. I gave this 5 stars. I have no notes, and I enjoyed the way that it expanded from just being a portrait of one person to also being an analysis of society and the humankind as a whole in very profound ways. We are allowed right into this very personal relationship, kind of held in an embrace as we explore these two characters' hearts and their dynamic with one another, but also their dynamic with the world that they occupy and inhabit. So you kind of get both interiority and a look into the exterior world that we inhabit too. There's lines in this book that just so eloquently articulate these universal truths, and at times it made me feel really emotional. Like, I was reading this book with a pen in my hand, I felt like I underlined so many things on every single page, and it recognizes and acknowledges and essentially apologizes for the complexity of each individual person, and that can even be the person closest to us, like our mum. I've always hated the notion, in life or in fiction, that the human personality is a puzzle to be solved, that we are a single flashback away from understanding why this person is cruel to her children, why that man has a dreamy, downcast look. A human being is not a lock, and the past is not a key. I loved this book. Okay, we have 3 more to go in this video. This is All the Lovers in the Night, and I have been a lover of this book every night since I read it. Let me just read you the opening line because you'll understand why I instantly fell head over heels for this book. And it's a long one, so bear with me. Why does the night have to be so beautiful? As I walk through the night, I remember what Mitsutsuka said to me, because at night, only half the world remains. I count the lights, all the lights of the night, the red light at the intersection, trembling as if wet, even though it isn't raining. Streetlight after streetlight, tail lights trailing off into the distance, the soft glow from the windows. Phones in the hands of people just arriving home and people just about to go somewhere. Why is the night so beautiful? Why does it shine the way it does? Why is the night made up entirely of light? It is like the night is breathing, like the sound of melted light. The light at night is special because the overwhelming light of day has left us, and the remaining half draws on everything it has to keep the world around us bright. You're right, Mitsutsuka. It isn't anything, but it's so beautiful that I could cry. So, as you can tell from that passage, All the Lovers in the Night focuses on quite mundane, ordinary details, but makes them so gorgeously whimsical. And I think the strength of this book is the way that it identifies and recognizes the beauty in normal, everyday things. Things that we all encounter on a day-to-day basis, or in this case, the night. The dialogue between the characters in this book is always really thought-provoking and puts things into words in a way that makes you want to like jump up and down and be like, yes, that is exactly it. Like, you nailed it. That's exactly what I was thinking. It's exactly how I feel. Every lyric, it's exactly how I feel. This book is so special and magical, but I love that I'm saying that about a book that is just about the normal world. Like, finding the magic in the world that we inhabit is so precious. It also contemplates the idea of being alone and being lonely, and how those two things are not necessarily the same. It grapples with alcoholism and anxiety and being a victim of being stuck in your own brain. And it's also about dependency on other people. It is razor sharp, frustrating at times for sure, but so beautiful that I could cry. And I will read anything that Mieko Kawakami writes, and I should also add that this is translated by Sam Betts and David Boyd. Next up, we have Love in the Big City. This is by Sang-Young Park and translated by Anton He. I read this in Seoul, in Korea, underneath the cherry blossoms, sitting on a bench. The blossom was like parachuting down from the branches around me, and I just felt so grateful to be alive, because this book captures, again, like All the Lovers in the Night, just how special the everyday can be when we really stop to consider it and take it in and slow down for a second. It's such a wonderful novel about growing up and coming of age, and such a perfect book, I think, to read in your 20s, because it starts by following these two best friends who are living together, and they just get themselves into all kinds of trouble. It's just pure chaos living together. They spend every paycheck on having fun. They have cigarettes in their fridge. They go out, they have casual sex. They just are enjoying every moment of life and living frivolously frivolously, and we really feel included in that friendship between the guy and the girl. When we reached our mid-20s, Jaehee drank and went out with multiple men as if it were an Olympic sport and she were competing for gold. Since I hated losing, and since I was into booze and men to begin with, I also got drunk and slept with a new man every night, and every morning. I realised anew that the world was filled with lonely people as I walked out of the motel cluster in the Jungwoo district with my hair in disarray. I love that extract. It's just from chapter 2, and I think that was the moment where I realised, oh, this is gonna end up in my favourite books of the year video. You know, it really reminded me of Melodrama by Lord in the sense that we talk about this party that we feel like is gonna last forever, and then all of a sudden the lights have come on and it's the cold light of day and you're confronted with the reality of a new dawn. And the strobe lights don't last forever. I actually read this and listened to the instrumental of Melodrama by Lord like the entire time, and it really elevated the experience. I think it's the perfect companion book to that album, and that's an album that means so much to me, so I immediately just fell in love with this. We mostly then, after that initial scene, stick with the guy's perspective and we watch him navigate his late teens all the way through to his early 30s. We watch him enter a relationship that turns out not to be good for him and also one that does. And he says, "I used to feel like I'd been given the whole world when I held him, like I was holding the whole universe." Imagine someone saying that about you. We then see this really raw and candid and heartfelt discussion about HIV as well as the death of his mother. It's a really powerful entry into the queer canon. There is so much texture to this novel, it really is endless. I can't wait to read it again. And it's a fun story about lots of kind of mishaps, but it's also very serious at times too, and I think that does recognize the peaks and troughs of life. At times it's about surrounding yourself with people, with strangers, and yet still feeling completely alone. And it also considers the spaces and the places that we find connection, that we find kindred spirits, capturing both the glittery nightlife of the city, but also the reality that it must come to an end. And thinking about those things simultaneously, I think this is so excellent. And the final book I will be talking about in this video, and I hope at this point you can see why I had to split this into 2 parts, because there's just too much to say, there's too many good books, but this is Couplets. This is a story told through verse. It's a series of poems, but they are all cohesive, and like Love in the Big City, it follows one person navigating coming of age, coming out, falling in and out of love. It's erotic, it's deeply sensitive and delicate, but also so striking. It really toes the balance with like a surgical knife. And that balance is why I think this title is so perfect, Couplets. You know, 2 things which are different, they exist separately, at least ostensibly, and then you realize that when put together, they create this rhythm and rhyme and flow, and they complement each other and they tell us about each other. So I think I love the title Couplets because it is about couples, but it's also about rhymes and difference and similarity and finding those connections. I loved this section here. Change is constant and inexorable. The Oxford comma isn't really optional. You will fall in love, the relationship will end, though not at the same instant as the love. Some version of this will continue, maybe forever, happening to you. Again, I found words like that so comforting this year. And what I liked is that this book really considers that love is not a finite resource. Like once you've had it once, that doesn't mean you can't ever have it again. And it also doesn't mean that love you've had in the past has to be undermined. That love can still be precious, even if you are now experiencing love in different ways, in different capacities, with different people. And there's one section where she talks about how we are kind of in this constant communication with all of the people we have loved. And she talks about that specifically through the image of kissing, because that is of course a physical, literal way that we touch. But I think you can think of it in a more spiritual way as well. So listen to this. And when I was not unbelievably sad, I was moved unbelievably. To hold inside me both my lovers, and to introduce them to each other there, in the hollow just above the heart, among the little folds where the voice starts. I devoured this book. I just loved it, and I've read it so many times since first encountering it. It's one that I love to just kind of flick through every now and then. And so of course it had to find its way onto this list. So thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that this has inspired you with some books that you would like to read in the next year, and I will be back with part 2 to this video in like, give me a week to put that together. Because, spoiler alert, we still have all of these books left to cover. And I'm very, very excited to tell you about them because in this pile are some new favourite books of all time. In the meantime, you can catch me over on TikTok and Instagram and all of those other places. The Goodreads, the Storygraph, that's where I update all of my kind of book reviews. So head over there, subscribe to this channel if you're new. Have a wonderful, wonderful Christmas if you celebrate. Thank you so, so much for all of the support this year. It has meant the absolute world to me, and I hope that this channel has helped you to find a book that you really enjoyed in 2023 or one that you're going to read in 2024. All the best, stay in touch, have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you very, very soon. Bye-bye.